My grandmother left me her bakery when she died, and while I was still crying at her graveside, my aunt and uncle had already filed the paperwork to transfer it, using a signature that wasn't mine. I didn't find out for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of casseroles on the doorstep and sympathy cards on the kitchen counter and my mother telling me to eat something, please, just eat something. 3 weeks of thinking I had time. That grief was allowed to take up space before I had to deal with anything practical. I was wrong. My grandmother, I called her Gran, ran Holloway's on the corner of Birch and Clement in our town for 31 years. It wasn't a famous place, you won't find it in any food magazine. But if you grew up in that town, you knew it. Saturday morning cinnamon rolls, the coffee that came in those thick ceramic mugs she never replaced because she said the chips gave them character, the way she remembered everyone's order after the second visit and never wrote it down. She started it with my grandfather before I was born, and when he passed, she kept it running by herself. That mattered to her, not the money. The place had never made anyone rich. What mattered was that it was still there, that something they built together was still standing. She told me once, when I was maybe 12, sitting on the flour sacks in the back room while she rolled dough, "This place will need someone who actually loves it, Tatum, not someone who just sees what it's worth." I was 29 when she died. I had been helping her there since I was old enough to work the register without a step stool. I knew the suppliers by name. I knew the oven ran hot on the left side. I knew the Wednesday delivery guy would be 20 minutes late every single time and to just account for it. My aunt and uncle knew none of that. They hadn't set foot in the bakery in years. I found out on a Tuesday. I had gone to the county recorder's office to ask about the probate timeline, just to understand what I needed to do, what paperwork would be mine to handle. The woman at the counter looked up Gran's property records while I waited. She turned her screen slightly toward me, then seemed to think better of it and turned it back. "Is there a problem?" I asked. She was quiet for a second. "Are you a beneficiary listed in the will?" "I'm the sole beneficiary," I said. "She left everything to me." Another pause. "You may want to speak with an attorney." She wouldn't say anything else. I stood there for a moment, not understanding, and then I drove straight to the bakery. The sign was still there. The closed notice I'd put in the window after Gran passed was still taped to the glass, but there was a different lock on the door. I stood on that sidewalk for a long time. I remember a woman walking past me with a stroller and glancing at me like she wondered if I was okay. I wasn't, but I didn't know how to explain that yet because I didn't fully understand what had happened. I called my cousin, my aunt and uncle's daughter, Phoebe. She picked up after 2 rings, which told me she'd been waiting for the call. "You need to talk to your parents," I said. A long pause. "Tatum, I told them not to. I want you to know that. What did they do?" She said it quietly, like saying it softly might make it hurt less. They had filed a transfer of ownership 3 days after the funeral. They had submitted a signed consent form, my signature, on a document I had never seen. I sat down on the curb outside the bakery. I don't even remember deciding to do that. My legs just gave out. "They said you weren't in the right headspace to make decisions," Phoebe said. "They said they were protecting the asset." The asset. 31 years of my grandmother's life, and they called it the asset. I didn't yell. I remember being surprised by that. I had always assumed that when something truly awful happened to me, I would yell. Instead, I just felt very cold and very clear, like everything went quiet. "I need to go," I said, and I hung up. I had known my aunt and uncle my whole life. My aunt is my mother's older sister, and growing up, there were holidays together, and summer visits, and the particular kind of familiarity that comes from being in the same family photos for decades. I wouldn't have called us close, but I wouldn't have called us this either. My uncle had lost his job the year before. I knew that. My mother had mentioned it in that careful way. She mentioned things she hoped I wouldn't think too hard about. They had sold their second car. There was talk of refinancing their house. I understood later what they had seen when they looked at that bakery. They had seen a solution, a property with no mortgage, sitting on a corner lot in a town where real estate had gone up. They had done the math on what it would sell for, and they had decided that I, 29 and grieving and too emotional to handle it right now, was an obstacle. So they forged my name and filed the paperwork before I could think straight. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, including me at that point, was what Gran had done. I need to back up. About 2 months before she died, Gran had a health scare. Not the one that ultimately took her. A different one, earlier. A bad fall, a few days in the hospital, and the kind of wake-up call that makes a person want to get their affairs in order. She had called her attorney, she had updated her will, but she had also done something else. Something she hadn't told me about until she pressed a sealed envelope into my hands the day she came home from the hospital. "Don't open this now," she said. "Put it somewhere safe. You'll know when you need it." I had put it in the fireproof box in my apartment closet, the one I kept my passport and insurance documents in. I had not thought about it much since then. There had been time, I thought. There was always more time. After I left that curb outside the bakery, I drove home and I opened the box. The envelope had my name on it in her handwriting. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, and behind the letter was a document, a separate legal addendum to her will, signed and notarized, that named me as the designated successor trustee of a property trust she had established, and the bakery had been transferred into that trust 6 weeks before she died. I read it 3 times. The bakery was in a trust. My name was on it as successor trustee. The property my aunt and uncle had transferred, they hadn't transferred anything. They had submitted a fraudulent claim against an asset that had already legally changed hands. Whatever paperwork they filed was built on nothing. I sat on my bathroom floor with that letter in my hands and I cried. Not because I was scared anymore, but because I understood what she had done. She had known. She had known that something like this was possible, that people who loved money sometimes loved it more than they loved each other, and she had protected me before she was even gone. She had built a quiet wall around what she was leaving me, and she had handed me the key and told me to keep it somewhere safe. I thought about her at that kitchen table with her attorney, making these arrangements. I thought about her coming home and handing me that envelope without explanation, trusting that I would hold on to it. She was practical like that. She didn't make things dramatic. She just made things done. I called an attorney the next morning, not the family attorney, but one I found on my own. Her name was Miss Osei, and she was thorough in the way that made you feel like she had seen everything before and nothing surprised her anymore. I showed her the trust documents and the letter. I showed her the county recorder's filing my aunt and uncle had submitted. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to know what this means?" she said. "Yes. It means they committed fraud. Filing a false transfer on a property you don't have legal authority over. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal." I hadn't let myself think that word yet. Criminal. It sat in the room differently than I expected. She walked me through the steps. We would file to have the fraudulent transfer voided. We would document the forgery. The signature on their filing was not mine, and a forensic comparison would confirm that. We would report the filing to the county and potentially to law enforcement. And we would do all of it correctly, on paper, with timestamps, so that there was no version of this story where they could claim confusion or misunderstanding. "They're going to say they were trying to help," I told her. "They always do," she said. I asked her the question I had been turning over since the curb outside the bakery. Had Phoebe known the whole time? Miss Osei gave me a measured look. "That's something you'd have to determine separately." But the document they filed required 2 adult signatures from family members asserting authorization. Someone helped them. I thought about Phoebe's voice on the phone. "I told them not to. I want you to know that." I still don't know exactly how much she knew. I've made my peace with not knowing, mostly. People are complicated in ways you can't always map. What happened next was not dramatic, at least not in the way people picture drama. There was no screaming confrontation in someone's living room. There was no moment where I showed up at their door and threw documents in their face. What happened was quieter and, I think, more final for being quiet. Ms. Osei sent a formal letter to my aunt and uncle's home address. It laid out the legal situation, the trust, the fraudulent filing, the forgery, and it informed them that unless they withdrew their claim and signed a corrective deed within 10 business days, we would be filing a criminal fraud complaint. They called my mother. My mother called me. That conversation was the hardest part of all of it. She didn't take their side exactly, but she kept saying things like, they didn't think it through, and they're really struggling financially, as if I hadn't considered those things, as if I didn't already know, as if knowing somehow obligated me to absorb the damage. Mom, I said, they forged my signature on a legal document, and then they tried to take a property that Gran left to me. Silence. I know, she said finally. I know. She didn't say anything else, but she also stopped asking me to reconsider. My aunt and uncle withdrew the claim within 6 days. I don't know what conversations they had with their attorney or what exactly they were told they were facing. I know they signed the corrective deed. I know the fraudulent filing was officially voided. I know that the bakery is, legally and unambiguously, mine. I did not file the criminal complaint. That was my choice, and I made it carefully. What I asked for instead, through Ms. Zrora, Osei, in writing, was a signed acknowledgement from both of them that they had submitted a fraudulent document, not an apology, an acknowledgement, factual, dated, witnessed, something that existed on paper and couldn't be rewritten later into a misunderstanding or a mistake or a difference of opinion. They signed it. I've not spoken to either of them since. I reopened Holloway's on a Thursday morning in March, 4 months after Gran died. I didn't do anything big. I put a small sign in the window that said, "Open again. Thank you for your patience." I made the cinnamon rolls from her recipe, the one she had written out on a note card in her precise, slanted handwriting and kept tucked inside a ceramic jar shaped like a rooster that had sat on her windowsill for as long as I could remember. The Wednesday delivery guy was 22 minutes late. The first customer of the day was an older man who used to come in every Saturday when I was a teenager. He looked at me for a moment when he walked in, and then he looked around at the room, at the same mismatched mugs on the shelf, the same flour-dusted apron hanging on the hook by the back, the same slightly lopsided chalkboard menu that Gran had never straightened because she said level things look sterile, and he nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "It should be open." I gave him his coffee in a chipped blue mug. He didn't ask what happened. I didn't explain. There are things I understand now that I didn't before. I understand that grief makes people vulnerable in ways that other people can see more clearly than you can. I understand that family is not the same thing as safety, and that learning that at 29 is late enough to hurt, but early enough to still matter. I understand that my grandmother knew something about the people around her that she couldn't say out loud, and that she handled it the only way she could, by making sure I was protected before she was gone. I also understand something about myself that I didn't. Before all this, when my cousins said they thought I was too emotional to handle the decisions, what she meant, what they all meant, was that they thought my grief made me easy, that I would be too busy crying to look at paperwork. That loss would make me soft in a way they could use. What they missed was that I had spent my whole life in that bakery. I knew where she kept her important documents because she had shown me. I knew to look because she had told me to look. The same emotional attachment they used as evidence that I was too fragile to handle this was exactly the thing that made me pay attention. You don't get to tell someone their feelings make them weak and then be surprised when it's their feelings that save them. Gran used to say that the best recipes are the ones that have been tested in the worst conditions, when the kitchen's too hot, when the oven runs uneven, when something goes wrong and you have to figure it out without throwing the whole thing away. Holloway's is still there. The oven still runs hot on the left side. The mugs still have chips. I think she'd say we're doing fine.